The focus of this video is the typical dilemmas of immigrant families in the United States. We discuss these dilemmas and offer suggestions for assessing them and addressing them in clinical practice. All human beings are in fact part of a continuous line of multiple migrations since the first human beings migrated out of Africa many thousands of years ago. But much more than other countries, the United States has always been a country of immigrants. And we are also a country in which couples in each generation have been intermarrying and migrating to new cultural constellations with each generation more often than ever happened before. The first human beings came to North America from Asia through the Bering Straits about 15,000 years ago. They moved through the Americas for more than 14,000 years. Their population in all the Americas reached a high of between 10 and 50 million people. By 1492, somewhere up to 18 million of those original native people were living in what we now call the United States. By 1900, disease, wars, and the genocide by whites had lowered their population to perhaps 300,000. As Europeans consolidated under the U.S. Constitution in 1787, the native population was ignored. The Constitution explicitly excluded counting Native Americans. Today, there are about 5.1 million Native Americans living within the boundaries of the U.S. on land which was increasingly claimed by the U.S. and taken from the native population. To provide labor for the white population from the time of the earliest settlers in the 1800s, Africans were stolen from their land in Africa and forced into slavery in the U.S., mostly in what are now the southern states. The Constitution, while avoiding the word slavery, gave the vote only to free white men. It specifically gave slave owners 3 extra votes for every 5 slaves they owned. And this extra power of slave-owning states gave them enormous extra power in the U.S. government, including representatives for Congress, the choice of president, and the Supreme Court justices. 12 of our first 18 U.S. presidents owned slaves, and their personal lives were cared for by slave labor. In other words, only 6 of our first 18 presidents never owned slaves. This power of slave owners lasted until the Civil War. Women, who represent more than 50% of our population, have been able to vote for less than 100 years, only since 1920. In spite of our always having been a nation of immigrants, we have at times passed laws limiting the immigration of those who were not white. The Naturalization Act of 1790, for example, specifically limited citizenship to white men of good character, denying citizenship to all people of color, and laws criminalizing interracial couples were not finally declared unconstitutional until 1967. During all the years of our country's existence, immigration has been a major factor, changing us as we move through time. We represent the most diverse country on the planet, and our diversity is ever increasing. The English, of course, were the main immigrants in the 1600s, settling on the East Coast and later migrating west. The Dutch settled early mainly in New York and later in the Midwest as well. Other early immigrant groups included the French Huguenots, who settled primarily in Maryland and the Northeast. The largest immigrant group to the U.S. is actually German, though they have been among the most likely to ignore their heritage, preferring to identify themselves as Americans. In fact, Germany did not become a unified country until 1871. The majority of people in southern Appalachia, from West Virginia to Arkansas, define themselves as American, although by heritage they are largely Anglo-Irish and Scots-Irish. defining themselves as American undoubtedly relates to their not wanting to be identified as Irish, whom they viewed as a very different race. They did not want to be associated with the millions of Irish peasants who immigrated in the 1840s and 50s at the time of the Irish famine and settled mostly in New England and the Middle Atlantic states. Africans were brought in large numbers from the early 1600s as slaves, mostly to southern states, but also to the north, and over time many escaped north to Canada and moved in the Great Migration of the 20th century to northern and western cities. Chinese and Japanese immigrants came mainly to the West Coast, though they were for years treated as the unassimilable race, and many laws attempted to keep them from becoming citizens or bringing their families with them. Scandinavian and Finnish immigrants settled mostly in north central states, and Polish immigrants came to the Midwest as well, most of all to Chicago, while Italians migrated especially to the Northeast, most of all to New York and New Jersey, as did German and Eastern European Jews from the latter part of the 19th century. Mexicans, who were descended from the original settlers who had come through the Bering Straits, were settled mostly in the South and Southwest. Spanish immigrants came mostly through or to Central and South America. Even when it is freely chosen, and more so when it is not, the transition of migration, as Celia Falikoff has so well described, is replete with loss and disarray. There's loss of language, the separation from loved ones, the intangible emotional vacuum left in the space where home used to be, the loss of community, and the lack of understanding of how jobs, schools, banks, and hospitals work. Parents who migrate without their children, their parents, or their siblings live with their hearts in two places, one here and one where their families are. They hope their sacrifice will provide a better life for their families, but the relational costs of separation may be very high. Issues to consider in working with immigrants include their connection to what has been left behind, their reasons for migration, war, hunger, politics, economics, education, and so forth, their skills in language, education, work, and social adaptability, the age of various family members at the time of migration. It's extremely different to migrate in old age than as a young child, an adolescent, or a young adult. Their legal status, whether documented or not. The impact of migration on the family structure and hierarchy. Their sense of otherness or lack of belonging. Their sense of not being from here and not from there. For a 3 or 4 generational immigrant family who do not speak much English, there is likely to be a major disruption of the hierarchy. Where in the traditional context of this Chinese family, elders are revered and have considerable status, in the new context, their lack of language skills and lack of economic power may change their position in the family greatly. Young children who learn English most readily are likely to become the translators and then the negotiators for the family. Women, who often have an easier time making cultural adaptations because of their lower status and need to be adaptive in the original context, may gain increased stature in the family, while men's status may deteriorate if they cannot find ways to succeed financially or negotiate in the new context. Immigrants often feel caught between two worlds. Those in the culture of origin may see the immigrant's attempt to acculturate as a loss and a threat. Meanwhile, the new culture generally demands fitting in, trying to pass for the dominant culture and not be different. To do this, immigrants are pressed to give up core aspects of their identity. To make their lives in the U.S., they may lose their language and connection to family, culture, land, and history that were sources of strength and identity for generations. Those with white skin and European looks can generally pass in the dominant culture more readily than those who, because of darker skin color or other features, cannot fit in as easily. But the pressure to pass means that all immigrants are pressured to ignore major parts of their cultural identity and history in order to fit into the new culture. The impact of this loss may not become apparent for generations, but its loss is still powerful. One of the most important clinical points in working with immigrants is to help them not feel caught, but rather to see themselves as building a bridge and to help them maintain their ability to move back and forth along that bridge as needed to maintain their connections to their original cultural identity and history while expanding to adapt to the new context as well. Among the many barriers immigrants may run up against are undocumented immigration status, language and cultural barriers, discrimination, limited access to social services, and limited access to health care. These barriers frequently have profound impact on immigrants' jobs, finances, education, options, and other social dislocations. To counter these barriers, we must encourage immigrants in relation to what we know are key empowerment promoters: their language proficiency, obtaining when possible their immigration papers, their social supports, family cohesion, money, education and skills, jobs, hopes and dreams, their access to social and healthcare services, and their adaptability. We begin our assessment of immigrant families with our map for understanding the context for assessing all problems, the multi-contextual life cycle framework. We must take account of the many contexts in which our lives evolve. We begin with the individual level, the spiritual self, the mind or intrapsychic self, and the physical self or body. Next, we consider the immediate context of the individual, the family, kin, and community, the immediate family, the extended family, and the friendships, kin, and community networks. And then we must consider how all these contexts exist within the larger sociocultural context, the immediate cultural context a person or family lives in or is part of, the larger society, and the ecological system of nature and the geography of our world that embraces all of us. Now we have to consider that all people in these multiple contexts are always moving along through time. Nothing stands still, and these contexts are all always evolving. As people move through time, there are what we think of as vertical stressors that come down our individual, family, and sociocultural evolutionary tree. Poverty and politics that affect us over the generations, racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, violence, addictions, abilities and disabilities, emotional patterns of our families, cultural and societal myths, triangles, secrets, legacies, religious beliefs, practices and patterns, and so forth. Then again, there are what we think of as horizontal stressors, those that affect us as we move through our lives. First off, of course, are developmental changes, as we and our families and cohort move through the transitions of the life cycle. Then there are historical events, economic changes, politics, and other social changes that hit into our lives as we move through time. Thirdly, there are the unpredictable horizontal stressors, natural disasters, accidents, illness, migration, unemployment, and so forth, that we might think of as the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that may hit an individual, family, or community or society at a particular moment. This entire context is the framework within which we must consider and assess a particular problem if we want to help a person and family address. In assessing immigrants' adaptation, we need to pay particular attention to the context of the culture of origin, the context of the culture they migrate to, as well as the migration experience itself, which is often prolonged and traumatic. Specific factors to assess are age, life cycle phase, gender, education, documentation, language skill, race, and their family and social connections. When you explore them together, these factors can help to assess clients' change in socioeconomic status, the change in their social networks, and the changes they've made culturally, their adaptation to the new context.